Well, thank you everybody for joining and good afternoon. My name is Charles All. I am the Senior Policy Analyst at the Kentucky Chamber of Commerce, and we really appreciate you all being here for our second installment in a new webinar series focused on Kentucky's urban-rural divide, hosted by the Kentucky Chamber and the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky. Our first webinar in this series took place last month, and it's centered on healthcare in the context of the urban and rural divide. And in that conversation, we talked about not only some of the major disparities that exist between urban and rural healthcare, but also many of the shared challenges. And today, we're going to continue that conversation, but with a heavy focus on education, one of the most critical topics and issues in Kentucky. As with last month's discussion, our goal here is to foster a dialogue about the different experiences of Kentucky's urban and rural populations and discuss ways we can bridge the gaps that so often divide our Commonwealth. So our conversation is going to last about 1 hour. We'll go to roughly 1 o'clock today, and we are recording it, and we'll make it available on the Chamber's Bottom Line News website afterwards. So if you missed something, don't worry. We will be preserving this, and you can watch it again. Also, during the webinar, if you have a question that you would like to submit to our panel, you can use Zoom's chat feature or the Q&A feature, and we'll do our best to get to that. Though do be aware we have a whole lot of ground we're going to try to cover in just an hour. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into things. I'm very excited about our panel that's ready to discuss the urban-rural divide with a focus on education. We have an all-star panel of state leaders and policy experts with us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them. We have Senator Max Wise, who is the chair of the Kentucky State Senate Education Committee. He represents Adair, Clinton, Cumberland, McCreary, Russell, Taylor, and Wayne counties in the Kentucky State Senate. Representative Regina Huff is the chair of the Kentucky State House Education Committee, and she represents Whitley County and a part of Laurel County in the House. Ron Zimmer is a professor and director of the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky. His research focuses on school choice and school finance. And Raj Darolia is the Wendell Ford Professor of Public Policy and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Kentucky's Martin School. And his research focuses on the intersection of education policy, economic mobility, and financial security. And finally, our moderator for today's discussion is OJ Olega. OJ is the president of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, and he holds a PhD in leadership and higher education from Bellarmine University. We greatly appreciate all of you joining us here today. We appreciate your time, and thank you to all who have joined us on the webinar. OJ, I'm going to turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to all of our folks who are here with us today virtually. You could have been anywhere in the world, and you chose to be here with us on Tuesday talking about education during lunch. I think that says a lot about you, and it says a lot of good things about you. So let's go ahead and kick things off. The urban and rural education divide. First of all, we have to know what it means to be urban. We have to know what it means to be rural. Luckily, we got some smart folks here who can talk to us and tell us about it. So Doctors Ron and Raj, why don't you kick us off and give us some context here about what it means to be urban and rural in Kentucky?
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully people can see this. And give me a second to share this. All right. So first of all, I want to thank the panelists for joining us. I'm privileged to join this good discussion today, and also the Chamber of Commerce for co-sponsoring this. One of the things to start off is what is rural and what is urban. Some people might think of like Bourbon County as a rural area or rural school district, or other people might think of it as suburban. And so we use the Office of Management and Budget designation here, and this shows which counties we were talking about when we're talking about rural, which ones we're talking about urban in the state of Kentucky. So you see about 85 counties are rural, 35 counties are urban, according to this designation. We also just wanted to give a little bit of background about the current resources. So this is current expenditures per pupil based on data from the U.S. Department of Education. You can see that Kentucky, on average, spends less than the nation as a whole per pupil. And then when you break that down by urban and rural within Kentucky, both do spend less than the national average, but the rural school districts spend significantly less. We also show here test scores. This is a national test called the NAEP that the U.S. Department of Education gives, and this is in 2019. They test in reading and math, and we're showing reading here. And they give geographic regions pretty fine-grained designations here. So you can see the range of different definitions like city large, city midsize, and so on, all the way to rural remote. And these are the average test scores, and maybe not too surprising, the suburban large and suburban small are the ones with the highest average test scores in terms of school districts, and this is nationwide. But the two that have the lowest are city large and rural remote. So both these areas have this in common, that they are struggling to get to the national average of test scores. And so both of them are facing that challenge and have that challenge in common. We also break down the educational attainment for urban and rural counties. And this is percent bachelor's degree or higher for different minority and racial groups and ethnic groups. So you can see for African Americans and Hispanics, they do lag behind whites in terms of educational attainment, both in urban and rural areas. But one of the things that's interesting, the biggest gap you see between urban and rural areas is actually for whites in terms of educational attainment. So that's interesting to point out as here, but there is a gap across all these groups, both for across urban and rural areas. And then here we show educational attainment by counties. This is the percent of population ages 25 and over with an associate degree or higher. The darker green areas are the ones that have the highest educational attainment, and the ones with darker blue are the ones with the least amount of educational attainment. And you can see nationwide, we lag behind the United States, Kentucky does. But the dark blue ones are generally, and maybe entirely, in rural areas, where the urban ones are generally have darker green, meaning they have higher educational attainment. And finally, this is looking at less than a high school degree of ages 25 and older. And again, we have a higher percentage of our population with less than a high school degree relative to the United States. The darker blue are the ones with a higher percentage of population with less than a high school degree. So that's generally in the rural areas here. And the dark green are the ones that are in urban areas generally with less population that don't have a high school degree. So we thought it would be helpful to lay this out initially, just as background before we get into our discussion, especially the challenge of thinking about what is rural and what is urban. I think different people could have different definitions of that, but we use a federal definition here.
Well, that certainly is helpful. Raj, I don't want to cut you off if you wanted to add anything to that before we hop into the questions.
No, I'll just add two kind of points before we get into the discussion. One is clearly our definitions matter. They matter in how we measure things, how we put together those graphs and maps, and also how we think about different areas. But there are a lot of different ways to think about urban and rural and suburban. One theme that I think will come out, at least among the researchers, is that we really need to think about beyond kind of strict urban-rural divides when we start to think about problems and solutions. One of the charts there included rural remote and tried to break down some of these distinctions into more than just two categories. And I think that's critically important. It's harder to discuss and it's harder to create sort of individualized solutions in that way, but I think it's critically important. The other thing I'll mention, just related to attainment levels in areas. One of the things that's difficult in thinking about attainment in a rural area, an urban area, or any of those types of areas is that that's both a function of how much education people who grow up in that area are getting, and also if they migrate to other parts of the state or out of the state as well, right? And so that's going to be a function of labor markets, it's going to be a function of amenities available in certain areas as well. So that's the other thing to keep in mind. If we think about somebody who grows up in a rural area, goes to a rural high school, and then goes to college or not, that person may or may not be counted in attainment for that rural area because they may choose to move. And we know that there's differential migration patterns among folks from different areas as well. So just a couple more kind of setting the stage comments before we get into.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating, especially the migration patterns. I think if I was reading that state chart right, both my wife and I grew up in what I guess the OMB would designate as rural counties, and yet now we live in what would be designated as an urban county. So that attainment piece is interesting. I want to make sure we can get back into that. I want to get one topic out of the way first, which in education might be one of the least controversial topics we talk about today, which is COVID-19 and how that has impacted our urban and rural school districts. So anybody can kick this off, our policymakers or our researchers. How did COVID impact urban and rural school districts? Were those impacts different? And how should policymakers be thinking about those impacts with regard to how to support students, teachers, and families? And then obviously we probably all saw the governor's conference or a press conference recently on COVID-19 and with regard to masking and vaccinations for the upcoming semester. So please talk about that as well. So that's a big question, but basically how does COVID impact urban and rural school districts? Were they different? How should lawmakers respond? And then comment on the governor's recent press conference on the topic.
OJ, I'll jump right in if that's okay with everyone. You know, I will also, as a policymaker and chairman of the education committee, but I'm also going to use the hat of a father of 4 children that had to go through last year with COVID-19. I'm not sure how many of the panelists on here have children or grandchildren that saw that, but mine were elementary, middle, and high school. I saw everything from 4th grade up to a senior to deal with that. And I will say, I think I could speak for urban and rural. The difficult thing of last year was just the stop and go. It seemed like the momentum in the summertime was we're going to go back in person in school, but then all of a sudden it was pulled back right before that, where it seemed to me that a lot of local control decision-making was taken away. And then some schools tried their best to start in person. As numbers started to go up in counties, it was a pushback to go more virtual or 2 days. And I think that was difficult in the transitioning of normalcy for children, for teachers, for parents, especially parents that are working, trying to find a balance between workforce, home, and child's education. So it was a very, very difficult year. I think I speak for everyone of how difficult that was. Once again, teachers tried their best. It was what they were given and what they had to work with. I think every teacher I've talked to, especially my Senate district, would love to get back to in-person learning. There is a medium and a platform for virtual-based learning. Some students very well thrived in it. Some students did not. But I think overall, most of your educators, and probably I would speak for students and parents, feel like in-person education is the best method to going forward. I will say very briefly with the governor's press conference as it related yesterday, I've already been in discussion with all of my superintendents through either a text message or a phone call. Most of them feel like we just need guidance now. Either give us local control on the issue of masks. Most school districts are starting to see have came out with policy and plans. Some are saying mask optional. Jefferson County may say universal masking. I think that does show the difference there. But the key thing is listening to parents. What are the parents saying in that individual community? Are they going to school board meetings? Are they talking to teachers? We know we've got an issue here of public health versus education. And I think that's what it gets down to. I just hope that school board members and superintendents are listening to their constituent base as we go forward with the recommendations that were made by the governor.
Thank you, Senator. What other comments on this question?
So one of the things I would mention is I think it was challenging for both rural and urban districts. In a lot of states, they actually gave a lot of discretion to the school district. So for instance, in Texas, let the school districts decide. And because of that, rural districts were more likely to open than urban districts. So in some locations, I think the challenges were in terms of learning loss or emotional development loss were probably more acute in urban areas. Now in the state of Kentucky, I think it was a bit more uniform in terms of when we opened and closed, although Louisville and Lexington lagged behind a bit in terms of opening. So they may have had also more acute challenges because of that lag. We do know that there was learning loss, and it may have been especially challenging for special needs students, disadvantaged populations. So going forward, this is something we have to think from a policy perspective. How do we address those learning losses, emotional development losses for these populations? The federal government's providing resources to address some of that. I know the state and local school districts have to make some tough decisions and make them pretty quickly. And they have to bear in mind that some of those monies run out quickly in a couple years. So how they spend it they have to be strategic at thinking about long-term versus short-term. And there's going to be a cliff of the money running out in a couple years. So they have to keep that in mind when thinking about their expenditures.
Thanks, Ron. Representative Huff, I think you had a comment.
Yes, first of all, I want to thank you for having me join the panel today. I am very passionate about education, and I look forward to hearing everyone's response as well. In fact, I'm joining you from my school today. I came out to thank the teachers for their work last year. They're here for professional development, and to encourage them to just be calm and take everything as it comes for this next year. But I think that COVID adversely affected every student across the Commonwealth. Of course, the real struggle was broadband, and we did prepare for next year with $250 million within the budget to hopefully help that. But more to the point with the rule was that parents were given and provided packets if you did not have access to broadband, and that made students sort of forced to navigate the subject matter alone because parents were unprepared, and some were living with grandparents to be able to explain and work with their children. And I think that they are a group that has really struggled. Of course, there was lots of violence in the urban areas, and across the continuum, there was hunger, neglect, and during the pandemic. But more to the point that I think is the most concerning, where children were off the grid. We did not have face-to-face contact with those children. And as a former teacher, that was very alarming to me. So I think that we will provide the needed resources to recoup the loss in instruction. But I think the mental and emotional was a huge factor as well.
Thank you, Representative. I think that's a good point to point out how mental health became an even more central focus for our young people in particular over this past year and a half. Raj, you have any comments on this question?
I'll just add from the higher ed perspective, it's sometimes harder to get short-term outcomes at a higher ed perspective because the programs are often longer. A lot of adults and other folks take interruptive patterns and going to college even the best of times. And so it's probably something we're not going to be able to really fully understand the impacts of it for at least a few years. What I'd say is nationally, certainly we've seen less college going. And especially the thing that concerns me the most is really differences among different populations. I'll give just one example. The decline in community college enrollment far outpaces the decline among our four-year institutions. Now, I teach at a four-year institution, so obviously that matters to me, and I'm incredibly concerned about the students and faculty and staff here. But I'm even more concerned about folks that are community colleges and making sure that we get folks back on track. It's incredibly easy once somebody becomes into the post-secondary space to drop out, to not attach. And so I think we really need to be thoughtful about, especially some of these differences in certain populations that have likely struggled during this time. I think it's really called into focus, brought into focus, our need to think about access to college and post-secondary education as beyond just direct financial aid, direct instructional supports, but thinking about things like access to healthcare, material sufficiency, access to food, these sorts of things as we think about going forward and making sure we can come out of this pandemic, at least with some progress.
Thank you for that. I think that is really important in terms of providing opportunities for college and folks doing whatever post-secondary thing, which would be their particular prerogative. Actually, I think that's a good transition into the next topic, which is school choice. When you look at higher education and post-secondary in Kentucky, we've got the KEYS scholarship, which students can use for a number of different colleges. We've got the college access program, which students, need-based students, in terms of needing resources financially, they come from low-income background, can use it for a number of different opportunities. And same thing with the Kentucky tuition grant. You can use that from a need-based perspective to go to any of our private institutions that are SACS accredited. Effectively, dollars follow the students. That is school choice at the post-secondary level. But at the K through 12 level, it certainly is a different conversation. How do we think the concept of school choice plays out in an urban versus rural context? Is school choice realistic in rural contexts? And is there enough choice available in urban districts? So I want you to kind of speak to those questions. And then also this broader one, do solutions to educational challenges in urban school districts apply to challenges in rural school districts, or are there different challenges for rural communities? And anybody can start on this one.
So I'll speak a little bit to the K-12 issue here. So school choice is an area I do research in, and it's largely been an urban policy that's been leveraged or accessed. And that's because you kind of need a density of population with lots of choices to effectively use a school choice policy. And in rural areas, there's just generally not the density of population to have lots of different schools with different services and provisions. And therefore, we have mainly seen things like charter schools, magnet schools, even school vouchers when they have been used nationally, they have been in urban areas. And so this is an area that hasn't been utilized that much by rural areas. And the only exception to that is sometimes they've used these virtual charter schools where a person could attend from really anywhere. And therefore, you only need a couple students here and there from each of these different locations. But it's generally been an urban phenomenon, not a rural phenomenon.
What does school choice look like in a rural context? If anybody has any comments on that, or also in response to what Dr. Zimmer was just saying. Senator Wise, I see you've unmuted.
You know, I think school choice in rural areas that gets into homeschooling for the most part. There may not be a private high school. I'll look at my Senate district. I've got 7 counties. I do not have a single private high school in my Senate district. I have an elementary-based non-denominational Christian academy that goes up to 5th grade. After 5th grade, most of those kids transition into a public school in my district. Those that may decide to stay, it gets into a classroom size of maybe 5 or less students in that grade level. I do think that COVID-19 presented more school choice for parents, especially as it related to homeschooling. I think that it was a situation, once again, of this stop and go. Parents wanted something more of a routine. And I think you started to see, I think even before that, you were starting to see some issues that parents were concerned about. If it's a social issue, learning issue, whatever it may be, that they felt like they have a community of people. I will say in pockets of Adair County and some of my district, there is some really good homeschooling that goes on. But I think we also have to worry sometimes about homeschooling is what type of curriculum, what type of material is being used? Are these the type of environments that the child is getting what's best needed for that individual child? And so I think when we talk about rural, I'm looking at my district, and I think that's where it gets into more of a homeschool choice than anything.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Huff?
Yes, thank you. School choice, whether it's a charter or educational opportunity accounts, whatever it may be, I think it does lean more to urban areas. For myself, I supported the charter bill of 2017 and took a lot of backlash from my district because my district is rural, with the school board being the largest employer of our district. So to them, I was infringing upon the monies that were provided for public schools. But as I told them, we do not have any type of school choice here. It's just pretty much public. We do have one that's operating now that is on a religious basis, but to offer the opportunity to other areas when it wasn't applicable to mine, I strongly felt the need to do that. And I owned that vote, and I explained it over and over to the numerous, because they look at it from our perspective rather than an urban area where parents are begging that don't have the resources to attend a private school. And so I felt like that they needed the opportunity or a different choice. So that was where I stood on that, from that perspective and the concept of rural areas.
Thank you, Representative. And Raj, any comments from you on this? Well, I want to take what Representative Huff was saying, actually, because some of the common refrains is that there's concern that if you offer school choice, you will take funding away from public school systems, which is the next topic I'd like for us to get into, which is public education funding. Obviously, the SEEK task force is meeting to discuss what the SEEK formula will look like going forward. How does state spending on K through 12 differ among urban versus rural areas of Kentucky? And does the state spend more on one than the other? And if it doesn't, should it? Do urban areas rely more heavily on local funding? And how do federal funding resources treat urban and rural districts? Are they equal? And again, anyone can start on this.
OJ, I'll jump in on that. As co-chairman of the SEEK task force, it's been very, very eye-opening for me to understand. You talk about policy wonkiness and getting into things that can be very difficult. It's SEEK formula in Kentucky of something that was developed, when we started CARA. And we felt like it's a task force that need to be look at the situation. We've heard from school educators, we've heard from government leaders that have said, is it time to look at funding in Kentucky? I think Kentucky's got a very good model. I think that there's some equity of what they've done with school funding, but we talk about property taxes when we talk about an area such as Anchorage or Lyon County compared to an area such as Clinton or Metcalfe County. You've got a lot of discrepancies and a lot of issues right there in terms of how schools can be largely funded. We know also, population wise, some counties are growing in Kentucky, while some counties are starting to lose population from far west to possibly areas of Appalachia, Eastern Kentucky. So it's been a very interesting dynamic for us to look at. And we've looked at localized mandates. We've looked at the transportation cost of education. So there's so many things to look at. And I think it's been really, really well informed for us to sit back and take a look and decide, is it the time for us to start making some conversations and some tough conversations about equitable funding in Kentucky public schools?
Thank you, Senator. Representative?
Oh, thank you. I think that SEEK is a confusing dynamic for most people to understand, that we are funded by both state and local funds. And it's based on the number of students and their characteristics. For example, if you have a student that is low income special needs, or a student with English as a second language, they generate more funds for us than the other students do. So the local effort is deducted and from the total, and that's 30% for $100 of local property. I think that transportation within the SEEK funding is the most major concern with superintendents, because in rural Kentucky, we do travel. In my district that I just retired from a couple of years ago, we travel 5,000 miles a day. So is that proportionate to an urban school that does, is on good roads? We're talking treacherous terrain practically for some of these drivers. So I think that we need to look at this. I'm glad that my co-chair for education is doing this. We're also looking at a smaller group of what SEEK provides and the characteristics and what we need to look at going forward. So it's a tough calculation, but we're to provide a free and appropriate education for all, whether you are from a rural or an urban, and your tax funds are in a larger pool than in a smaller pool. So it's to kind of navigate that is tough, but I'm glad that we are looking at this. I think it's important.
Thank you, Representative. Ron, I saw you nodding during her comment, so go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to mention is Representative Huff mentioned it was both state and local. I think people may not realize how small percentage of federal government provides resources to local school districts. They're a pretty minor player in the funding of education. Traditionally, it was mostly local, and over time, state increased the percentage. And that was true in Kentucky too. In the early 1990s, there was changes and that's, I think, when the SEEK formula came about. And so that introduced a larger role for the state in trying to create greater equity in spending across school districts. And in the federal government, when they usually spend on categorical types of funding, things like special ed. And so that would be a function of how many special ed students you have. So if you disproportionately have a lot of special ed students, then you're going to maybe get more resources from the federal government. The other source from the federal government is Title I funds. And Title I is targeted towards low-income students. And they do it by numbers, as I understand, not percentage. And therefore, if you're a rural district, you may get less because of that, because it's not based on percentages, based on numbers, and urban areas generally have higher numbers. So there might be some cases for rural areas, they are getting disproportionately low numbers or high numbers, depending on what their population looks like.
Thank you for that. Raj, any specific comments on this one? Well, we're getting to higher ed, don't worry. So we're going to expect a lot out of you on those topics. But before we get there, I do want to ask about teachers. My first job out of college was teaching middle school math. I think it's one of the most difficult jobs, working with people that you can have in the country. It's certainly one of the most important. We saw that over the last year and a half. One of the things that we're seeing is that both urban and rural school districts may be struggling to find teachers. Could you all talk about that and how those struggles might be alike and or different, and whether or not the strategies to find teachers in urban and rural school districts should be the same or not? And Representative Huff, I see you're unmuted. I don't know if you wanted to start first or not.
Okay, that is fine. Yes, thank you. Well, I think there's struggles both in rural and urban regarding teachers. And last session, I sponsored House Bill 163, which allows for retired teachers that maybe their certificate has elapsed to be reissued and come back into the profession. And I hope that brings particularly more services for substitutes. I think we need to be reaching students in high school and even junior high and allowing them to be interested in education. We used to have groups called future teachers, but then we had an overflux of teachers. And so that group kind of fell off the grid. But I think we need to look at ways to improve and to entice the profession. Also, the conversation and the rhetoric surrounding education in the last few years has had an impact on those that are choosing to go into the field. And if students are hearing teachers, constantly complaining about their job, then I'm not surprised that they don't, want to enter that field. So I think we need to just clean up our efforts and speak to the fact that it is an excellent way to earn a living. I felt blessed truly to make a living teaching Kentucky's children. And I think that it can be back there again if we just have a message and make sure we're all on the same page.
OJ, I think we also need to recognize that this problem is not just a Kentucky teacher shortage problem. This is a United States problem across the board. I think every state is dealing with issues related to the workforce when it gets into education. I think we have to have some very tough conversations. Those conversations could also be about salary. It could be about competitiveness. We can also look at, teachers going into the profession, and the really good teachers, all of a sudden we see them up, we pluck and put them into administration. We get them onto a fast track. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but is it because of salary or is it because that's what the teacher wants? And so I know some very good teachers who about 5 to 7 years into their career, all of a sudden were administration coming to say, we need to make you this higher level. We need to take you to a fast track to principal or to administration. Sometimes that can be a good thing for salary wise, but for losing out for the individual classroom needs of those students. So I hope that we have a very good conversation about this. This is something we have been discussing in a lot of groups in and outside of Frankfurt of what we need to do to go forward. But we talk about this. This is a whole lot of issues right now in state government, trying to get state employees for a lot of different professions of going into them. So I hope we have those difficult but also good conversations. And I think a lot of it gets down to marketing the teaching profession. Teachers can sell themselves to market the job and get students to want to go into that. There's no better way some of us probably became professors and became teachers. It's because of an influence we had in the classroom as well. If those good teachers can latch on to students and talk about the benefits and the harmonious lifestyle that they have of working with students, that's one of the best ways to sell the profession as well.
Ron?
Yeah, so one of the challenges here, I think there are more acute shortages in certain areas. So for instance, special education, commonly both urban and rural areas, there are shortages there. For science and math teachers, both rural and urban areas are facing shortages of those teachers as well. And the other thing about teachers, they're often localized markets. So you don't see a lot of urban teachers in Lexington, for instance, deciding to move to Bell County to teach. It's more localized. Because of that, you have to think about the pipeline and what's happening in the pipeline. Is there sufficient students going through college and near those locations to meet the needs of the future teacher demands in those regions? So that's something to think about. And my understanding is nationally, there are fewer and fewer people going into majoring in education. And so there might be something you have to think about at the root causes. Why are we seeing that? And what can we do about it? There could be some policy levers there, maybe with scholarships or some other incentives, or just better marketing of those majors and highlighting the benefits and so on. But that's where I think we have to kind of start and then think about how we get them in the pipeline. So that's one way to think about the policy here.
I'll just add two small things. My understanding is if you look at kind of college education majors, it hasn't declined drastically in any sort of way. But we have a larger proportion of students who are studying education in college who are not going into the teaching profession. So I think that's worth thinking about as to where, what kind of jobs they're going to. Is there something that could attract more folks to go into teaching itself? The other thing I think we're starting to pay more attention to, but we really don't have great data on yet, is really the migration of teachers out of Kentucky into other states. And so, when we think about where students may go, it's not just do they decide to work in urban or rural areas, but there is competition from other states as well. And I think we need to think about how do we keep our best and our brightest here in Kentucky as well.
OJ, I want to jump in real quick if I can. This past year, I've been a part of working on an international study of education through SREB and NCSL. It's been fascinating. We've studied Singapore, we've studied Finland, we've studied Estonia, and looking at the international model of teachers and professionalism, professional development. And, I know this is not something new. We've done this for decades before, but trying to see in terms of, what is it that makes teachers in Finland be respected, the professionalism? And I think, Representative Huff talked about this, that there's times I think that teachers don't feel like this is a profession in certain areas of where they may be belittled. It may not be looking like it's a professional degree to go into. We have to change the stigma of that. I think those are some of the things we need to work on. And I think in the international community, it's been amazing for me to get into really some policy, into some study issues of some of these countries to see how are they doing this well, and especially the educational attainment that some of these teachers have. It's been remarkable. So I'm hoping we can bring some of this study group back into also Kentucky classrooms.
Well, I think that'd be great to get that information. Maybe we can have that for one of the future panels. We can get an update on the good work that you all are doing with SREB. I do want to get us to talk more about higher education. Obviously, most people become teachers because they go to college. One of the big topics about higher education is college affordability. So anyone can certainly talk about this, but Raj, I'm coming to you. College affordability in terms of urban and rural students. In Kentucky, do we have equal access to our state financial aid programs, again, with regard to urban and rural? And do our financial aid programs account for the different needs of urban and rural school students? And then, of course, just talk about student debt and what that looks like and whether or not that differs amongst those populations as well.
Yeah, thanks. So the short answer is that kind of on the face of things, urban and rural students will have similar access to financial aid. For going to college, a big part of financial aid, you mentioned, OJ, some of the state level programs that are effectively work-like vouchers. There's also a set of federal programs, which are prominent ways that people will access that aid. Now, there are formulas that determine how much anybody can get, and they don't distinguish if you're urban or rural, but implicitly they can, right? So assets held, income, family composition, all of these things will often build into the formula in how much money is available. I think the key distinction really in how much that, whether or not it's enough, is not necessarily whether people have access to the same amount in what's measured in the formula, but what is not measured in formulas. Our federal aid formulas certainly don't take into consideration kind of things that we don't find on like a direct household balance sheet. So one thing that it doesn't take into account at all is something like commuting costs to go to college, right? So if you live in a more geographically dispersed place, it's going to cost you more to get to campus, or if you're going to travel farther to be able to go to a college of your choosing, it's going to cost you more. That's not really taken into account well at all. So that's sort of a cost that family and individual would need to bear. I mentioned some of the other sort of costs and things that folks will, that we don't really handle that well. Lack of stable housing, lack of access to food. These are things that, we just don't have in our aid formulas in a way that's going to really help us distinguish between those who really need those funds or not. And so, officially, I think we could probably say that students, whether they're rural or urban, have access to the same money and they're treated similarly in the formulas, but the formulas aren't going to count certain things that are going to matter and might lead to some differences in whether students can actually afford going to college. I think about student debt, 22 hours a day, so it's something I could talk about for the next hour. But let me just say that if we look at kind of trouble with student debt, delinquency rates, default on student debt, we do see that it's higher in rural areas versus urban areas. Now, we have a lot more to do to distinguish what is causing that. A big thing, what I would just say is that student debt repayment is largely a function of labor market outcomes, right? And so if you have lower labor market participation in certain areas or lower wages in certain areas, you're going to have a tougher time repaying that debt than in areas in which people are paid relatively more or have a more robust living.
Thank you for that. That's incredibly fascinating. Representative Huff, do you have any additional comments? Again, your mute was off, so I don't want to miss you if you have comments to say.
Yes, I would just like to add that the last 2 years I've sponsored a bill making FAFSA a graduation requirement with a waiver. So students and parents have an idea of the financial options for post-secondary education. So much federal dollars are laying on the table that I would love to have Kentuckians be able to use to further their education. So that's something that I'm very passionate about, because I have found that some of the students that of today did not even know what FAFSA stood for. And so I just think we need to make them aware. And also, I think it's important that we need to share that the financial aid is available for non-traditional programs such as apprenticeships or work studies or and other technical education. I think we just need to do a better job marketing what we have to offer and to get the kids engaged in the process, knowing that I have this opportunity and this is the monies that I would be able to use to further my education.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Any other panelists have any other comments on this specific question?
Yeah, I would just echo Representative Huff's comment there that a lot of students don't even know what FAFSA is, don't know how to apply, don't know how to get the information. There was a fascinating study probably 10 years ago now that had people at H&R Block do this experiment with some people. They helped them fill out the FAFSA and some people they didn't, who were similar incomes. And they did see higher college going rate just because they were able to help fill out this form for them. So it seems like it's a simple thing that really could affect college going rates, is helping people fill out these financial aid forms.
Thanks for that, Ron. I know that KIA and CPE and of course IQ and many other different institutions are working hard for folks to fill out FAFSA. I know it's something that people focus on every day, but I think the innovation that was mentioned is key. We've got to figure out ways to get more students to fill this stuff out. I don't want to silence you, Senator, if you got any comments on this as well, but if not, we can move on to the next one, whatever you'd like.
Feel free to move ahead. You're good.
Let's do that. Let's talk about college degree attainment. We saw, based on the charts we were looking at earlier, there is a gap that exists in a lot of ways between urban and rural college degree attainment levels. Could you all speak about what you think could be done about that, either from a policy perspective or a marketing perspective? Again, we talked about FAFSA some, but what might be thoughts beyond that?
I can start off. So one thing I think, we often think about post-secondary education is related to degrees, and research suggests that the benefits to the individual and society are definitely highest for bachelor's degrees, associate's degrees. But these degrees are also not going to be kind of the right choice for every person. And so I think one thing that we also want to think about in kind of educational attainment and post-secondary attainment are alternative certifications. So Kentucky's actually one of the nation's leaders in granting shorter term certificates, sub-associate, sub-baccalaureate certificates. And so I think we have a lot to do to kind of recognize the value in some of these credentials. We have a lot to do to understand which credentials work for which people as well. But I do want to start with that by just saying that, when we think about degree attainment, yes, I think it's a good goal to try to optimize, especially bachelor's degree attainment and associate's degree attainment in our communities. But there are other credentials that can certainly add value as well. One thing, if you look at sort of the metrics within kind of high school achievement to college going, is that urban and rural districts, suburban districts are actually not that different on some dimensions. I'll give an example is ACT scores. We don't actually see a huge difference in ACT scores along our different dimensions. If we look at kind of first year college going among our urban and rural high school students, it's actually not that different. But then you get to some of the graphs that Ron showed before, we see pretty stark differences in attainment in some of these communities, right? And so I think there's a couple things that lead to that. One is rural students are more likely to go to community colleges rather than four-year colleges. That's certainly true when we look across the state. And then the other thing that happens is something I mentioned before, which is that college graduates, whether associate degree or bachelor's degree graduates, are more likely to leave those rural areas. So if you're a rural high school student, you're more likely to migrate to whether an urban area within the state of Kentucky or outside of the state as well. And so that's leading to differences sort of in high school achievement and maybe even college achievement among those who go to rural high schools, but really stark differences in educational attainment in communities. So I think that's something that's important to think about when we think about educational attainment. To me, again, I study a lot of labor market transitions and other things. Part of this is making sure there's investment in the workforce in communities so that the individuals want to return or migrate to rural communities as well. The other thing I'll just mention is that while we see kind of ACT scores and some other things kind of equal across or relatively equal across some of these districts, what we don't see as equal are some things that we know matter and we don't really count with. So things like math and science courses, advanced math and science courses, like that is much more likely to be available just because of scale in larger urban school districts than there is in rural school districts. If we look at AP test taking, AP test passing, much higher rates among urban districts in Kentucky than in rural districts. And this can't just be because of preferences, right? A part of this is availability. And so when we think about things that lead to success, including high school preparation, this is something that we should be thinking about in addition to finances and all of the other things that we typically think about.
I think that's really good, really detailed context. One of the things that you mentioned in terms of understanding how we go to college is the expansion of it. Career and technical education is included in that. Obviously, a lot of advocacy groups point to career and technical education as a way to promote workforce development as well. What comments might we have from the panelists on that as including career and technical education as a way to reduce the skills gaps that might exist in rural areas?
OJ, I think this is one of the biggest issues right now, not just facing rural, but also urban, is trying to get the workforce back into Kentucky. There was a really good story PBS just did. Actually, I think it was yesterday, focusing on Jefferson County Public Schools and one of their Louisville academies of GE Appliances working with Dawes High School. And it was a student who was a young Black male who now is a high school student, but had always been in and out of situations within the school with home life. His mother was also part of the interview. This student from basically kindergarten up through 9th grade just was in the classroom. The learning style did not work for him. But all of a sudden, once the student got into the Louisville Academy and was able to do hands-on work with the GE Appliances and robotics, it's changed that student's life. And he's now going to go to college next year. He's making $15.50 an hour right now as a high school student with benefits. Now, can that happen in every county in Kentucky? Maybe not so. But we have to look at that. We have to look at the buy-in. If there is an employer that's willing to partner with a public high school and catch that student at a young age and try to attract them into, hey, let's take you out of the classroom. If this doesn't work well, it's kind of like virtual learning. If that's not good for you, let's put you in this learning style. Let's put you in this environment. I could not imagine being a sophomore or junior in high school making $15.50 an hour with benefits and seeing what may be an opportunity. Now, we also don't want to limit that student and say, this is your career. You're never going to do anything other than this. That's absolutely wrong, and we will not be doing that. But we have to look at what are some opportunities there for students. And I do think in rural and urban, sometimes it just gets down to, is there the buy-in with the town and gown? Is there the buy-in between the workforce and at the high school level to, let's say, let's partner up. Let's make it for that student that can get credentialed. If they're a student athlete, we always put about 4 hats on the table and say, here, they're choosing between 4 Division I schools to go play college athletics. Let's have 4 different employers out there and say, I'm choosing GE, I'm choosing Toyota, I'm choosing Murakami. Those are the types of things we need to change. That's my personal opinion, but that's also one thing that I've seen that we're trying to work on in Kentucky. We need to get better at.
Thank you, Senator. Representative Huff?
Yes, I think one of the problems, especially in rural Kentucky, is students just don't know. I think we need to do a better job in high school. And now we have the Kentucky Students' Right to Know Act, which is an online tool that offers high school counselors and career centers a matrix of what it costs and what you could expect to earn after you have completed the skills needed. And I think that's very enticing to students to know this is available. This is something that could be in my area, and this is what I will earn as a living. I think we need to be focused on getting them involved in making decisions earlier. We do have plans where we talk to students about their career readiness, but sometimes we just lose our focus. And for example, I'm a special needs teacher, and some of my students would say they wanted to be veterinarians. Well, I knew that a student that's mild mentally disabled, which is 2 standard deviations below the norm, probably wouldn't be able to be a veterinarian. So we would go to another avenue, maybe grooming or whatever. So I think you need to tweak it for each student and let them know that what we have out there and that's available, and particularly center it to your area.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Wise touched on something I thought was really fascinating. He mentioned the town and gown. The combination of the higher education community, the K-12 community, the business community, working together to help find jobs. There was a question that came up in the chat that I think speaks to sometimes when one of those is missing. If your community doesn't have a college nearby and an education desert effectively. So I want to make sure I get this question right. It says, how do you think about education deserts and how that impacts college going in rural areas? So this can be to any of the panelists who would like to speak on this.
I can start here. I think it's a serious challenge. I'll say that. I mean, the research suggests that certainly nearby college options increase the probability that someone will go to college, and there's a number of mechanisms that could be at play there. But that's certainly something that we see empirically. To me, it's a hard problem, right? Because it's very costly. We can't just build colleges in every town in the state. That's an incredible investment. To me, this isn't a solution, but I think it helps us get a little bit of progress here. Is that we should be really thinking about pathways from one level of education to the next level of education that allows students to really try things out, invest in themselves. If it's not a good fit for them, kind of have an off ramp that's not super costly. But if it is, continue on with kind of easing that. So we talked about CTE before. I think this is actually a good pathway to the workforce. It conceivably should be a good pathway to post-secondary education as well, right? Especially if we do it right and we don't track kids. We actually don't know that much about our post-secondary outcomes for our students who are doing CTE. We need to know that, but easing that transition from secondary to post-secondary, I think is critical. Easing the transition from a shorter term certificate program into an associate's degree is critical. Easing that transition from an associate's degree to a bachelor's degree is critical. Now, again, this doesn't solve the issue of education deserts, but it allows students to kind of take smaller steps, less risky steps along the way, and they can keep on investing themselves. And if they do want to then make that move maybe to a location that has a broader set of educational options, then they'll know more about their potential success in that as well. The other thing I'll just tack on to the end here, we've talked a lot with college attainment about high school students and going into college, and that's naturally who we think about. Another really critical part of this population, especially think about educational attainment as adults, especially those who are trying to reskill, maybe that have gotten a bad draw at work or have lost their job. And there's just a whole other set of considerations in trying to help these folks increase their human capital as well. And so I just do want to mention that especially when we're talking about attainment, that's a really important group that we should be thinking about.
That is really important. I know we've got only a couple minutes left. Do our panelists have any other thoughts on this topic of education deserts or any other closing comments on the education urban and rural divide in general? If none, this panel has been incredible. We learned a lot, I think, from our four folks. Charles, I'm turning it back to you.
Well, thank you very much, OJ. I get the distinction today of being the guy that has to end what I think is a really good conversation. But I do appreciate you all for your time and for this very thought-provoking discussion on such a key topic in Kentucky, such as education. I know I learned a lot, and this has given me a whole lot to think about. So we greatly appreciate all of you doing this. Conversations like this are exactly what we were hoping to drive with this webinar series. And as I mentioned at the outset of the webinar, today's discussion was the second installation in a three-part series hosted by the Kentucky Chamber and the Martin School at UK. First webinar focused on education, or actually focused on healthcare. Today, of course, focused on education. And I do want to make everybody aware of our third webinar, which will take place next month. And that's going to focus on economic development in the urban-rural divide. So this conversation is not over. It's something we're going to continue talking about. So please keep an eye out for more information on that final webinar in this series, which we should have ready here very, very shortly. So do keep an eye out for that. On behalf of the Chamber, I want to thank our partners at the Martin School of Public Policy and Administration at the University of Kentucky. And I want to again thank our panelists and our moderator, OJ Oleka. We greatly appreciate your time, and our panelists, Senator Wise, Representative Huff, Dr. Zimmer, Dr. DeRolia. Thank you all so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. And of course, I want to thank everybody on this webinar who attended and took time out of your day. As I mentioned, we will have this posted up on the Chamber website, and we will share it on social media, and you can rewatch it, share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues. So once again, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon.